Hi, I'm Lis Wiehl with Law and Crime. We're taking a break here in the Shaun Harrison case, and that's a good thing because I have with me in the studio, I get to introduce my guest for the next couple of hours, Andrew Maloney, another former federal prosecutor. I'm so glad to have you with me to analyze this. So we just had a witness on the stand, a young man from the school there with the defendant's school. And he was testifying about things that had happened in the school. He was testifying about how the defendant had treated him, wanted him to engage in drug trafficking. When I say drug trafficking, I'm talking about marijuana, which is a sort of a lower level drug, if you consider all the drugs that you and I probably prosecuted. What did you think about his demeanor? Now, we're talking to some folks. Some folks are listening to us on Sirius XM, so you got to tell them a little bit about what you saw. What did you think about his demeanor and his testimony?
Well, his demeanor was what you would expect from, a teenage boy in sort of a low-income background, maybe not well-educated, but street-savvy, street-smart. And he came across that way. He came across as somebody you might expect might be looking to, make some extra cash by selling marijuana. So
somebody you might approach if you were Shaun, the defendant.
Exactly. So in that sense, he is believable. He's exactly what you would expect to see in terms of somebody selling marijuana to other students or selling it on a street corner. Not that there's a prototype for that, but if you had to do central casting, he would fit the mold right there.
Okay. And so you found him believable. You found him credible.
Well, I didn't listen to enough of his testimony to determine, whether or not there are holes in it. Certainly on cross-examination, you want to know a lot more about whether or not he has some motive to lie. Because for any witness, you have to test their credibility through cross-examination to determine whether or not they were in a position to see and hear what they are testifying to, whether or not they have a motive to lie, whether or not they have a relationship with, in this case, the victim, perhaps, as opposed to the defendant. They all seem to have a relationship with one another. Certainly, the Reverend knew these boys and knows the people that are the guys that are testifying against him. So one has to ask oneself, what's the motivation for him to lie if he's lying? Certainly, I've seen cases where you get a bunch of teenagers together to lie about somebody, but this has a little bit more of a ring of truth to it because it seems to be that there's been substantial evidence and testimony that they were selling marijuana at the behest of the Reverend. More importantly, the victim himself has claimed that he was shot by the Reverend.
Right, and that's pretty amazing testimony right there. But so incredible, if it's true, to think that this man, the Reverend, was leading such a duality of lives, right? I mean, to be at this school, to be a reverend, to be out there, not just as a teacher, but as a reverend, as a minister, as somebody who was counseling these boys, who was, being a role model, who was someone who was teaching them, doing all these righteous things. And then on the other side, selling drugs, and that's not the worst of it, okay? Selling drugs is bad enough. But then when the drug weren't going fast enough, this is all allegedly from the victim's point of view, going fast enough, or the sales weren't going well enough, they wasn't going, pop, 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 as well as the Reverend wanted them to. What does he do? He shoots this young man, allegedly in the back of the head, execution style. I mean, it's an incredible
It's
story.
Pretty shocking. Unfortunately, we've seen far too many times the people that we trust the most sometimes let us down the most. A school teacher, a preacher, a priest, abusing children. It's unfortunate, but it does happen. And I think sometimes people gravitate to places like teachers to sort of have their cover story. It may be the very reason why he's going to trial. I mean, the evidence seems pretty compelling. I haven't heard enough of it to be able to make a decision on it, but that's probably why he and his lawyers felt that they should go to trial, asked the jury to render a verdict because
it's so
before this,
unbelievable
it's
almost.
unbelievable.
Right.
Before this, he had apparently no arrest record, I understand,
Right.
and hadn't gotten into trouble, and so he had a fairly good reputation, and it's hard to believe that he would do something as shocking as this. But it does happen, and certainly you have to just look at the evidence.
Right, and then when you have somebody like a teacher talking, coming forward, and you have to look, and I agree with you, and we're going to take a break in just a moment here, but when we come back at the other side, I want Andrew and I to continue. I want to have your analysis on exactly that, the credibility of some of these witnesses, and we'll analyze that because I agree with Andrew that the real reason I think that this case is going forward is that the defendant wants to test the credibility of all of these witnesses, to try to poke holes in their story, to say, this is so unbelievable, jury. It would not have happened. It could not have happened. I'm a good guy. I never would have done this. I never would have betrayed the trust, the sacred trust that was put on me by these students, and as a reverend, I would not have done this. And I think that's exactly right. I think Andrew's got it exactly right, that is why this case went to trial. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back on the other side with more analysis and more back in the courtroom replays of what happened today. Hi, I'm Lis Wiehl, back here in Law and Crime, and we're back with the Shaun Harrison case. It's in Suffolk Superior Court in the Boston area. The jury has gone home for the day. Remember, this is the case where the defendant is charged with armed assault to murder, not actual murder, because thank goodness the victim survived the attempt. This was an execution-style attempt. Andrew Maloney, who is here with me today, also illegal possession of drugs, firearms, and ammunition. Of course, he has pled not guilty. Andrew, this reverend, as he's called in the school, a teacher, allegedly had a drug ring going on the side. He was having these young men sell marijuana for him. And allegedly, when this young man, the marijuana sales were not going fast enough, apparently, he shot this boy back of the head and, intent to murder. This was a charge. Of course, he's lucky, really lucky, that this young man didn't die, and he was able to testify as he did on Friday about being in a room. There were just two of them in a room, which is what he testified to. And we think that it's going to trial because Harrison's saying, I'm just such a good guy. I am this reverend. It's absolutely incredible that this would, incredible being not credible, not incredible like a good thing, but not credible that this would ever have happened. And so they're testing really the witnesses here to a large extent. We've seen, a couple of witnesses that have said there was this drug ring going on. Did you find them believable, Andrew?
Well, the answer is yes. The short answer is yes. Certainly, I'd like to know more and see more of them. I didn't see them all testify, but they are exactly what you would expect to see in terms of teenage drug dealers selling marijuana at the school or outside the school. That's the type of person you'd expect to see.
Right.
That's the type of witness you're going to have on the witness stand. And as you know, having been a prosecutor, you don't get to pick.
They're not going to be choir boys.
They're not going to be choir boys. You're going to be hearing from co-conspirators in a drug conspiracy. And they're all going to have issues and they're all going to have problems. And so you look for corroboration. You have corroboration from one testifying in a similar way that several of the others do. But again, one could attack that and say they've all sort of ganged up on the teacher.
Right.
And so you have to look.
Be angry with him for some reason,
exactly.
for whatever we know.
That's right. And so you have to look for a lot more than just that. And I think that the Reverend has gone to trial relying on his reputation and hoping that his lawyers can show reasonable doubt for the jury and that he is acquitted. It does strike me as odd that the victim, Mr. Rodriguez, who was shot in the head, who's testified that it was the preacher Harrison that shot him.
Right.
You would think that he would not have a motive to lie about that.
Exactly.
If I was shot in the head, and I survived, I'd want to make sure the guy that pulled the trigger is going to jail. And so he's got a huge motive to come clean about not only his own exposure as a drug dealer and that of his friends, but to make sure that they're getting
the right guy.
That they get the shooter, in this case, the Reverend.
Right. I mean, you would think that, and he wouldn't have had the time or the inclination to hatch a plan with several other kids, other witnesses that we've seen on the stand here. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
No, and it'd be interesting to see if Reverend Harrison, I keep calling him Reverend, I think he's a Reverend. It'd be interesting
he calls
to see.
himself that anyway. So
I'd like to see if he's going to testify in this case. As you know, most defendants do not at the advice of counsel testify.
Right, exactly.
We'll see if he does. I'd like to know what his alibi is in terms of his explanation, other than that all these kids are lying. If that's his only defense here, I think he's got problems.
Would there be any way that he could shift it to self-defense? I mean, I'm trying to think if I'm putting myself in the defense shoes here. Any way to shift that to be self-defense?
Two things I'd say it's too late for that. First is
you'd have to,
they've already opened and not said it was self-defense.
Change, you can always change that.
Well, you can, but then you start to. The jury starts to question the credibility of the lawyer who didn't tell them that at the outset. And the second, and this is probably the most important, Mr. Rodriguez was shot in the back of the head.
Well, I know, but you know how the gun was, his handle switched around. I know. I'm trying to think. Yes, it was shot execution style.
And I believe the gun was. I think the gun was registered to Reverend Harrison. I think it was his gun.
Right.
He had guns.
Right. It was. I'm just still trying to think about if it gotten somehow. I'm stretching it here. I'm obviously stretching it here. I'm not, but I'm just thinking of anything in the defense side.
It wouldn't have been a bad idea for them to use the self-defense approach
from the beginning
if you have a drug conspiracy, but you probably have to admit to being the ringleader of a drug conspiracy, which
he's not going to
sounds like he doesn't want to do.
No. Yeah. It sounds like he's just going with, they're all lying, it wasn't me, I'm clean.
Right. None of this is true. Not only did I not shoot Rodriguez, but I don't sell marijuana either.
Right. Well, I think then to try to further that theory, probably somebody who is not a kid involved in the selling, and obviously not himself, not the defendant, would need to take the stand. And let's look a little bit at that, because we do have somebody that testified earlier, and that is a teacher at the school. So she's not part of the drug ring, and she's not the defendant, obviously. So we have this earlier today, a teacher at the school. Let's replay a little bit of that, and then Andrew, I want to come back to you and see what you think about that. So let's go to her testimony. This is now a teacher at the school who testified earlier today. All right, so there we have a video that we were seeing inside the school there in Suffolk County in the trial there of Shaun Harrison. And that was shown for us from a teacher talking about it and a fight there that happened. Andrew Maloney, this is with me here in the studio. What do you make of the teacher's testimony? And again, when we went into that, we were talking about somebody who is not part of any of drug sales or anything like that that are allegedly sort of run by the defendant in this case.
Well, she's the most credible witness that has taken a stand in the trial so far. She's got no motivation to lie, no agenda other than telling the truth. She came across as very believable, very credible, mature, articulate. And told the jury what she saw, what she remembers. That testimony is important. It's consistent with the allegations being made that Reverend Harrison had these two boys, had one of them pick a fight with the other one because they were part of his drug conspiracy, and I think Rodriguez was not pulling his weight, I guess that's the allegation, on selling enough drugs, and so he orchestrated the fight, and when it broke out, he didn't do his job, didn't do anything to break it up. He wanted the enforcement to take place and pretended that he was calling for help when he really wasn't. Now, what does that say about the case? I think it's consistent with the testimony you've heard about the allegations of him being a leader of a drug ring, but it's not really direct. It's more circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence could be pretty persuasive, but it's not direct evidence that he was leading a drug conspiracy or that he did the shooting. It's
not the smoking gun for the prosecution.
Correct.
It's consistent, but it's not going to win them the case, win them the day. All right, Andrew, thank you so much. We're going to go to a break right now. We'll have more analysis and more testimony in the case. So as soon as we get in the Harrison case, as soon as we get back from this break, stay with us. Well, this was a teacher who is pretty fair and impartial, with no axe to grind here, not part of any drug ring in the school, so credibility is pretty intact. And she says that the defendant Harrison was not, quote unquote, not attempting to break up the fight. Was looking at the kids who were fighting. In other words, not doing anything about it. Did not call the cops, did not pick up the radio to call the secretary who would call the police who were there at the school, who would come, as the teacher said, maybe they do something about it, which is kind of a sad commentary, but that's another story. And it seemed to me, and Andrew Maloney, I want you to step in here as well, from the teacher's demeanor anyway, that she really doesn't like the Reverend very much, because from looking at this tape and the video, and doesn't really believe that he was credible. He was not trying to break up this fight.
Well,
she
clearly believes the Reverend was not trying to break up the fight and may not have been taking the situation seriously and calling for help or doing anything to stop the fight. She clearly believes that. She seems believable. As you said, her credibility is intact. I do think that if you were trying to establish the fact that the fight took place and Reverend Harrison didn't break it up, I think she's done that.
Right.
What that shows, what that proves exactly towards the drug conspiracy and or shooting of Lis Rodriguez is another story. It's consistent with allegations about the Reverend having one boy start a fight or beat up the other one for maybe not obeying or not producing as much revenue in the drug sales. It's consistent with that.
But just stop you, and even having the drug ring to begin with, right? Because if his defense is, I'm a reverend, I'm this great guy, I don't have kids in drug rings, I don't sell drugs. So it's really consistent just with the fact that he has a drug ring to begin with. Forget about even getting to the murder part.
Well, that's true. The consistency part is there, and that's why the prosecution's put on Miss O'Flaherty. But her testimony in isolation, while believable, is really circumstantial. It doesn't actually equate to direct evidence of the fact that there may have been a drug conspiracy, a drug ring operated by Reverend Harrison, or that he pulled the trigger to shoot Lis Rodriguez. It doesn't show either of those things. But it is consistent with Reverend Harrison's desire to enforce his protocol in terms of how much marijuana you're supposed to sell and getting another kid to be his enforcer, so to speak. So it's consistent with that in a circumstantial way.
Okay, but, you know, former federal prosecutor that you are, you know that sometimes circumstantial evidence is all the evidence that you have, and that you build your case on circumstantial evidence, brick by brick. You put your mortar and you put it all together, and with that you come up with a pretty darn good case, because many times, in fact most times in cases that are brought to trial, they are brought to trial because you don't have direct evidence. You don't have somebody that can testify, I saw him with the gun to my head. Oh, wait a second. We kind of do have that in this case. Huh. We actually do have that in this case. We do have the victim in this case.
Evidence. And that's what we call direct evidence.
Yeah, we have exactly direct evidence. We have a surviving victim who can say, I was shot by this guy.
Yeah, that's true. And you were right. Circumstantial evidence can be very compelling depending on what it is and how much of it is that there is. It's just as powerful as direct evidence, sometimes more so. And you do put it together brick by brick. But here we do have direct evidence. We do have the testimony of Lis Rodriguez that says, not only was I shot in the back of the head by the Reverend, but and this is a statement against interest, I was part of his drug posse.
Right.
I was selling drugs for the Reverend, and I wasn't doing a good enough job, and we got into a fight about it. Maybe he threatened to expose the Reverend, and that's what drove the Reverend to eventually pull the trigger. I don't know. But certainly you have the direct evidence from Lis Rodriguez, and now you have circumstantial evidence from
supporting what he's saying
from this teacher's testimony, and you have other direct evidence, at least for the drug conspiracy, from other co-conspirators, from the other teenagers that were selling drugs for the Reverend, or at least what they testified.
Well put, well put. And you just bring in the other teenagers that were selling drugs for the Reverend. And so to back that up, and Andrea, let's take that from there. Let's bring in another teenager who was just on the stand testifying about selling drugs for the good Reverend Harrison. Let's go to that. Interesting testimony, Andrew. Now, this is a student who is talking about a drug deal potentially between the victim and our defendant. And so that would, if you believe him, if he's credible, that would place our defendant not being the Reverend, the good Reverend that he wants us to believe, that he wants the jury to believe, and would make him instead the bad guy in all this. Now, what I want you to see here, okay, I want to slow this down, just slow it down, and let's watch it. Maybe watch it a couple of times. This is, what we're seeing here, is what the jury is going to see if they haven't already. The video of the actual, it's not good quality or anything like that, but this is the video camera was taken of the actual shooting. Let's roll it again so we can see it again, people that are actually watching it with us. Can we roll that again, producers, please? I want to see that again. Look at this. Okay. Very hard to see what's actually going on. Andrew, what are you making of this? Let's describe it.
The one thing that's important to note is they're out on the street, and there's only two people there.
Right.
Walking together. Obviously, like they know each other. Having a conversation. And the person in the rear lifts his arm up. You can't actually see a gun from the video, but if that's the time of the shooting, that's when the trigger was pulled. So it's not as though it's a crowded street with a lot of people around, or there might have been
looked
an
almost like a
discharge.
push away almost.
Yeah, well, if he extended his arm to pull the trigger, if that was if that's the video that's showing the shooting, you can't tell from that. But it does a lot of things for me. It says first, it's not an accident. There's no other suspects from the shooting on the street. There's nobody else around. There's snow on the street. It's not a crowded street. There's nobody else walking around. The two people are together, so the victim knew who the shooter was.
No surprise element. That's
Lis Rodriguez has testified that it was, in fact, Reverend Harrison. So from that, it seems to indicate there's no way he would mistake that. Assuming he didn't sustain some kind of brain damage or have another reason to lie about it, it would put him in a position to know who shot him.
Can we run that again? Let's run that B-roll again. I want to see. Let's do that again. That's really critical stuff, I think. Let's see that again. I think that really for everybody watching. Let's see that. Let's run that B-roll again. That's those critical stuff. There you go. Okay, again, no cars. Look at that. A lot of snow. Yep. Boom. Wow. Just two people, and then there you go. That's the critical timing there.
He's running away.
Wow. Running away.
So this is the victim, Lis, on the street trying to hail a car to take him to the hospital.
And two people, no surprise element, running away, knew each other.
And one last thing it dispels is any idea that it was self-defense.
Exactly. You don't see any of this going back and forth with the gun. You don't see any of this maneuvering for the gun. It's one.
There's no fight.
Person,
there's no struggle. There's nothing other than an attempted execution, it looks like.
Oh, my gosh. What a piece of evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so glad of you viewing this, or seeing this on SiriusXM. We're trying to explain it as well as we can. I'm so glad we saw this.
The one thing it doesn't
Wow.
do is identify both the shooter
Right.
and the victim. But we know who the victim is. We know from his testimony what he did after he was shot. He was able to get out to the street
Right.
to hail a ride to get to the hospital. So you can see that on the videotape.
You see that,
So
yes.
the only thing you can't see is the identity really of the shooter. But we now know from Lis Rodriguez's testimony who that shooter was.
Wow, it is just absolutely, you know.
I'm also, I know that the police haven't testified in this case yet, but I'm told that they conducted a search warrant of Reverend Harrison's house and they
Yes.
found marijuana, guns, and ammunition. The guns may have been legally registered. I don't know for certain at this point in time, but certainly that's all adding up on the side of the prosecution here, and it's looking pretty dim for the Reverend at this point.
And the marijuana, of course, would corroborate the fact that, or the allegations anyway, that he was he was pushing people, these young men, to sell marijuana, and eventually had a ring of people that were selling marijuana. Wow, I'm so glad we had that B-roll to look at. Let's go back now to another young man who was testifying about the marijuana exchange that was happening between the victim in this case and the defendant, Mr. Harrison, Reverend Harrison.
I don't remember.
Now, Andrew Maloney, we're here talking about we're at the trial of Shaun Harrison for his intent to murder Lis Rodriguez. But we have on the stand here a young man who's basically talking about dealing drugs. Now, apparently he said that he was asked by the defendant to deal drugs, and he said no. But is that problematic for somebody when they take the stand and say, yeah, you know, somebody told me to do drugs or deal drugs and everything, and he's just admitting that on the stand, and he's under oath?
Yeah, if you admit that you broke the law, that you've committed a crime, and drug dealing is a crime, even marijuana, certainly back in 2015 it was a crime, you expose yourself to criminal ramifications. Typically, before a witness takes a stand and admits something like that, they have their lawyer cut a deal with the district attorney's office or the federal prosecutor to say, I will testify, but I want immunity from prosecution for that, or I want a deal so that I don't do any jail time for my past crimes. That's typically what happens, and that's usually fodder for cross-examination by a defense lawyer to suggest you're up here lying about my client so that you could get a deal and get all your prior drug dealing stuff washed under the carpet. I'm not sure how it transpired here. I think all these guys are under the age of 18, and maybe there was maybe there was no reason that the prosecutor felt like he should aggressively go after them to prosecute them when they'd only go to juvenile, some kind of juvenile facility. Obviously, the more important case was against the ringleader, the reverend, the teacher at the school, and in particular because of the shooting. So it makes sense that the district attorney is more interested in getting Harrison rather than these kids. On the other hand, it still begs the question, because each of these students has testified to either being a drug dealer, having sold drugs, or using drugs, basically committing some bad acts. And that could have criminal penalties unless they got a deal cut prior to taking the witness stand.
That's a good point, yeah. And then it happens more often than not, because oftentimes you're dealing with people that have already committed a crime that happen to be your defendants. Not that your defendants, your witnesses that you've got to put on the stand if you're the prosecution. So you've got to deal with that. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to have a report on the victim's testimony for you all to hear and listen to. It's going to be very important for you to analyze that. But we'll take a quick break, and we'll have that on the other side of the break. All right, Andrew, slumping drug sales as the motive for shooting him execution style in the head? I don't know that I buy that.
That seems to be a bit of a stretch. It's more likely that they had a dispute maybe over the slumping drug sales and that perhaps
That's a minor.
and perhaps Rodriguez threatened to expose the Reverend.
There
In other
you
words,
go.
stop pushing me around, Harrison. Otherwise, I'm going to go to the cops
Right.
and rat you out.
Right.
And if that's the kind of threat he made, then it's much more of a motivation for Harrison to say, I'm going to get rid of this threat.
Right. Let's think of so. Rodriguez is 17 now. He was 15 at the time. So he's not a little kid, he's 15.
I think he was 17 at the time of the shoot.
17 at the time, okay, so even more so. He's not a little kid. He's been selling, if this all is true, let's just take it for a moment and say it's all true. He's been selling for a while. It's exactly as you say. It's like, wait a second, slumping drug sales, slumping marijuana sales. I'm not going to take this anymore from you. I'm exactly that. I'm going to expose you. I don't need to do this anymore. And by the way, you're not paying me enough. And, this deal that we'd set up, which is basically I give you pretty much all my proceeds, and I'm not doing this. And I'd get beat up and all this other stuff that we've seen from this other testimony. It seems like just from a human nature standpoint, a lot more motivation than just simply slumping drug sales. Harrison, I'm going to knock you off for that. And because of the manner in which allegedly this happened, an execution style, which is so angry and brutal. Like angry, like how dare you, I meant towards you and you came back at me like that. Not just slumping drug sales, but you came back at me, we're going to turn me in.
Lis, I agree with you. As an outsider, that would be much more of a motivation to, you're now trying to preserve and protect what you have, which is your job, your reputation, staying out of jail, and you see this kid as a threat. You want to terminate the threat, and that would be the motivation to shoot him. I don't see it as being a lack of drug sale performance. And yet, we didn't hear any of those details from Luis Rodriguez. And maybe, I know he was shot in the head. I don't know how much he remembers. It took a while for him to
come forward.
And even say it was Harrison that shot me. And the defense is going to make something of that delay. But
can you imagine how frightened he would be? Oh my gosh, he tried this one time. The next time he'll really get me. I mean,
and the initiation of the disagreement might have been over his lack of drug sale performance, but that was probably not the motivation for the shooting.
Right.
I would think that they had a dispute because of the poor drug sale performance.
Right.
And Rodriguez said, "Stop pushing me around. Stop pushing me around, old man, or otherwise I'm going to rat you out."
Yeah.
And that was it. Harrison said, "Oh my God, this kid's going to rat me out. I'm going to neutralize this threat."
And who knows how many times they've had a similar argument? Maybe this was just one too many.
Well, you heard testimony about the fight that was allegedly orchestrated by Harrison at the school in the bathroom. That was the first step to maybe silence.
See if that would work.
And it may have only fueled Rodriguez's fire to say, "I'm not going to let you push me around and don't send your dogs on me, otherwise I'm going to rat you out."
Right.
And that was when Harrison realized, "Oh my God, this threat's not going away unless he goes away." And that was when he decided to shoot him.
Right. And when you see that video, I mean, it's just so, if true, it looks so premeditated. I mean, they're just out there. There's nobody else out there. It's just the two of them. And then you see him running away, You
see him lift his arm, and then it sort of goes off screen. I think that's the time when he pulled the trigger, because immediately after that he runs away. And then within seconds after that, you see Rodriguez stagger out into the middle of the street in front of a car looking for help.
It's just so chilling to see. And if it is, Harrison pulling that trigger, it is absolutely, as Rodriguez recounts, execution style, because of the way that he's holding his hand up and pulling that trigger. Absolutely. It's a fascinating case, but in looking at the package that we just saw, and looking at that testimony, I just think there's more to it than slumping drug sales. But let's hear more from the student that was actually there in the high school that saw the encounter between the victim and the defendant in this case. Let's hear more from him. So as we were listening to the testimony of this young man, this other student here, testifying about his connection with both the defendant, Reverend Harrison, and the victim in this case, Andrew Maloney and I were talking about what the defense might be saying here, that the victim, the defendant is a whole other scheme could be going on here, where these young men could be saying, no, it wasn't the case at all that Harrison himself, is really the victim in all of this, that these young men are making this up, that there's a larger kingpin out there, that the marijuana at Harrison's home was just really for recreational use, and that Harrison is just caught in a horrible position here. He had nothing to do with this, and these young men are really afraid of the real drug kingpin, let's call him Mr. or Ms. X out there, and that's what this is all about. I mean, it could be that the defense comes up with something like that, and that he would have to testify to that, obviously.
It's not uncommon for in the drug trafficking world that is violent by definition,
of course,
to have enforcers out there that for whatever reason decide they're violent people and to shoot or kill somebody for a whim.
And it would be like an execution style killing.
Harrison doesn't fit that mold, and yet we speculated that perhaps Rodriguez was going to expose Harrison, and that would have been enough motivation to want to kill Rodriguez. That's one possibility. That's one theory that we're speculating upon. But it may also be that there's another drug trafficker out there, a kingpin, who has no qualms about pulling the trigger on anybody, and did this, and Rodriguez survived and was told in no uncertain terms, okay, you got my message, right? And if you say anything about me or any of this other stuff, you and your whole family and all your friends are going to be gone. You better find a scapegoat for this. And they turned it on Harrison. Maybe Harrison bought marijuana from them, and they knew that he was a user, and they knew he was a good dupe. Right.
And Harrison, by the way, has 8 children. So he has, maybe some of them are grown, maybe some of them are dabbling in marijuana themselves, maybe some of them are in this or that trouble. We just don't know. So there's ultimately there's lots of possibilities here. And don't forget, it's just one juror that has to have that reasonable doubt in a trial.
Let me play devil's advocate. If you have 8 children and you're actually supporting them, it takes a lot of money. So you might not have that kind of income as a teacher. So you have to supplement your income by drug trafficking to help support your.
Okay. So now we're on the we're on the other side. So he needed the money. Poor defendant, but I don't think that would be a cause for a necessary reason for you to go out and shoot somebody. Thank goodness in this case that we're reported, at least in Law and Crime, that we do have a victim who is alive and can testify. And it was wonderful and gratifying to see in that package that we had earlier that he was testifying and he was on trial. Andrew Maloney today, thank you so much for being with us. I'm Lis Wiehl signing off today for Law and Crime. Stay with us tomorrow and we'll have more on the Harrison case out of Boston. See you tomorrow.